Hi everyone, it's Darren, aka FizzFop, and I'm just laying out enjoying the last days of summer with some poolside reading. Yeah, since I did my video on the Charlton Hero line, I'm always getting requests from people to do more Charlton, so I thought, yeah, why not? Let's do it. My book of choice today is The Comic Book Guide for the Artist, Writer, and Letterer, 1973 edition by CHARLTON Comics. Reprints of this book are available through Charlton Neo, and you can find them on Amazon. Years before Stan Lee and John Buscema did How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, and before Joe Kubert started up his art school, there was this little book. Charlton had a weird cult following unlike any other company, and I think a major part of that was that Charlton was the proving ground for comic book pros. Artists and writers would start there for very little money. They learned their craft, and if they had talent and patience, they could eventually jump over to Marvel and DC. In the 1960s, it was Jim Aparo, Pat Boyette, Denny O'Neil, Roy Thomas, and Dave Cockrum. And in the 1970s, it was Joe Stanton, Tom Sutton, John Byrne, Mike Zeck, and Bob Layton. And that list goes on and on and on. As a doorway to Marvel and DC, Charlton was getting 2 portfolios a day by people wanting to break into the comic book industry. And it was assistant editor Nick Cuddy's job to review the artwork and writing samples that were being sent in. Being a comic book fan himself and being very enthusiastic about being in the comic book industry, he took the initiative to contact the people who sent in their work. Cuddy is actually known for being one of the very first comic insiders for doing serious reviews of fan art. It actually got to the point that Cuddy was spending one whole day of his work week just going over the artwork and scripts that were being sent in, and he found himself repeating the same criticism over and over and over again, and a lot of it had to do with the mechanics of making a comic book. There were artists putting way too many panels on a page or sending in pinup style artwork. Writers sent in narrative stories that weren't in comic book script form. At first, he created a group of mimeograph sheets that were stapled together in a bundle, and this bundle contained some of the basic pointers on how to make comics. And he would mail this out to people who submitted work, or they would give it away at comic book conventions. Anyway, even after trying to streamline the time he was taking with these unsolicited submissions, it was still taking away too much time from his editing job. So he got permission to make this book, The Comic Book Guide for the Artist, Writer, and Letterer. Originally, he made this book solely for people who sent in submissions, but as it became known to the public, people began contacting Charlton just for the book. Finally, Charlton came up with the idea to use this book as a subscription gimmick. Buy a subscription to a Charlton title for the hefty price of $1.25, and you would get this book for the low, low price of free. So now let's take a look at how to make comics the Charlton way. First, this book explains the basics. A lot of the terminology we take for granted today is well known, but back in 1973 there wasn't a lot of information specifically about comic books. There were books about cartooning in general, like for the Sunday newspaper strip kind of thing, but none that I know of that was specifically about comic books. This was possibly the first book that talks about splash pages and proper border spacing. There's pages listing tools that a professional comic artist would use. This book really is a time capsule of the comic book industry. The best example I can think of about that is when it talks about inking. It goes over cross-hatching and wash, which is still techniques used by artists today, but it also goes over things like Ben-Day dots, or zip tones as it was known. It's a clear adhesive film that goes over top of the piece of artwork, and it gives the sense of shading. It's the little dots you've probably seen on older artwork. I think Ben-Day was a publisher back in like the 1890s, and he was the first person to use this technique, so it became known as Ben-Day dots. And it was pretty common from like the 1890s until maybe the 1980s. I remember when I was in high school seeing art stores that still sold it. I went online looking for it not too long ago and found one company in Japan still makes it, and it's like 4 sheets for $17. Maybe I'll do a future video on just Ben-Day dots. There's also a page or two explaining the types of panels, close-ups, bust shots, silhouettes, panoramas, those kind of things. And you see a lot of this kind of stuff actually in filmmaking books also. And after the basics of drawing, it goes into the basics of script writing. It talks about action scenes, dialogue, caption boxes, format, stuff basically. Next, this book goes into lettering. Very underappreciated skill if you ask me. The letterer is often the unsung hero of the creative team. Back then it was all hand lettering. Today I think a lot of books use computer fonts. If you're interested in lettering, you can go to a website like defont.com and find hundreds of fonts for use. They've got hundreds of comic book fonts there. This book also goes over sound effects and word balloon types. Finally, this book ends with the complete regulations of the Comics Code Authority. This was the censorship code that comic book publishers had to be in compliance with. At the time of this book's publication, the CCA was still a force to be reckoned with. I think this was the first time I've ever read the entire Comics Code. I've seen parts of it listed in articles and books, but this is the first time I've seen the entire code in print. So, that's Charlton's The Comic Book Guide for the Artist, Writer, and Letterer. Originals are really hard to come by. I haven't seen one available for a long time. I remember seeing one about 20 years ago at a Comic-Con. It was being sold with the mimeograph bundle and some correspondence from Nick Cuddy, and the dealer wanted $50 for it. And at the time, it was way out of my price range. Come to think of it, it's out of my price range today. But anyway, a group called Charlton Neo is keeping the spirit of Charlton alive by reprinting Charlton books like this one. And they did this with Nick Cuddy's blessing, by the way, and Cuddy even writes a new intro for this reprint edition. And you can get it relatively cheap on Amazon. I think I paid like $7 for it. I bought it on a late Friday night, and I got it early Sunday morning. It's a nice little book on the mechanics of comic books. It also is a great time capsule for the comic book industry. So if you're really into comics, check it out. All right, well, that's about it for me. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Please hit the like button and leave comments down below, especially if you know where I can get my hands on some Ben Day dots. One last thing before I go, I would also like to mention that I opened a Patreon account. I've been a little reluctant to do this for whatever reason. I'll leave a link in the description section down below. Please consider it. Thank you again for watching, and bye for now.